Alright, so now I've got the whole thing stitched together, and then I've also got all of the seams held together with dabs of crazy glue all the way up and down both the deck and the hull of the boat. So the next step is going to be to get into the epoxy. But I'm thinking about the order of operations on this build because I'm trying to get a clean build and an efficient build. So I don't want to have to keep going back and retouching the stain or redoing things over and over again. I would like to minimize the mistakes. So I think what I'm going to do on this next step is paint on the epoxy on the outside of the deck and the hull before I do the fillet on the inside. That way no epoxy is going to come seeping through the stitch holes that I would have to then sand off of the outside later on, because the more sanding I do on the outside and the more I have to go back and retouch up the stain, the more steps I have to go back and repeat. So again, I'm going to cut off all of the copper stitches, and then, separately, I'm going to roll on a coat of epoxy on the outside of the boat. And that will work its way not only into all of the stitch holes, but also that'll help hold the seams together. So, seems like a good idea. I don't know. We're working on it. It's a work in progress.
Well, that's typical. I'm so deep in thought, I forgot to say welcome back to another episode in this build series. Today we're going to get the inside of the deck and hull glassed.
Okay, when I cut these wires, the only thing holding it together is going to be the crazy glue, and it's very brittle and not strong at all, so you can't sneeze once it's all cut off. It might just pop apart, so cross your fingers and wish for the best.
Now, admittedly, I've never had one pop apart, so maybe I'm just being a little bit paranoid. In fact, it's probably perfectly fine, but it is a little nerve-wracking, so I try to be careful.
Before I flip it over to paint the outside with epoxy, I'm going to seal up the seams with this painter's tape to keep the epoxy between the seams, and also to keep it from running through these holes and just dripping out.
Yeah, I waste a lot of painter's tape doing this, but I think it's worth it to keep it from making me do more sanding than I want to do. So anyway, I get it painted onto the deck nice and smooth, and then I go and do the same thing for the hull. First, I'm going to remove these bulkheads and wrap them in tape. I should have done this before installing them in the first place, but I want to make sure when I put the epoxy on the outside of the hull that it doesn't seep through and, permanently install the bulkheads, because these are going to come out in order to do the glass and the, everything else. These will go in after the boat is in one piece. So I'll snip off all the stitches, and I do leave a couple at the extremes, at the ends of the panels and at the ends, the tips of the boat, just to make sure. Now I want to take a minute to show you how I do my epoxy mixes. You can see on those bottles that they have pumps which are calibrated to give you exactly the right amount every time you pump. And this is a 2-to-1 ratio, but the thing is, those pumps are garbage. And you'll be mixing your epoxy and have one suddenly go pfft, and you don't know how much volume you lost in that bubble, so the whole thing's messed up. And do you want to risk using the bad mix? You really shouldn't. So I've moved over to these syringes. I do 2 shots of the resin and then 1 shot of the hardener, and I can see exactly how much is in there. If there's any bubble, I know exactly how big it is, whatever. It's just a much more deliberate way of mixing my epoxy. And at first I thought it would be more work or, more steps, but really it's worth it for me. You can do whatever you want, but the insurance of knowing for sure that your epoxy mixes are right is well worth whatever extra time it might take in mixing. I'm not trying to rush that part. Getting it right is more important.
Good thing I put that tape on there. That never would have came out. Oi. Out, and then I'll be ready to fill it in glass. Moving right along.
So I think one of the main questions in this video is, should you fill it and then let it cure and then do your glass, or should you fill it and then glass on top of it while it's still wet? You could do it either way. It's just if you do it one way versus another, there's different things to consider. And I chose to do it wet, and I think I may let it cure next time and just use something like peel ply, or just make sure it's a nice clean fillet and then let it dry. The reason I do it wet is to avoid bubbles in the glass between the glass and the fillet. But if you're able to, get the fillet nice and smooth while it cures, then it shouldn't be a problem. But the fillet, the thing about thickened epoxy is it's extremely sticky, so it's very hard to actually get it very smooth. And if it isn't perfectly smooth when you glass over it, it's going to be full of air bubbles. So that's why in this build I chose to put the glass on while the fillet is wet. That way I was able to, make sure that it's just going to be a perfectly smooth, no bubbles at all. But the downside is anytime you tug on the glass, you're pulling on the fillet also. So it does end up giving it a little bit of a wavy look and a little bit sloppy. So I think the way to do it next time would be just put the fillet and then use something called peel ply to hold it in place nice and smooth while it cures. And after it cures, you peel that off and then you glass over it. So I probably won't do it this way again. It is a little bit sloppy, but it's something to consider. You can see there the waviness in some of the fillet. Now it's structurally fine. It's not going anywhere.
Through an extra piece of 6-ounce tape. I always do the inside of the deck first to get used to it again and practice and make all my mistakes so that when I get to the hull, all my mistakes are done. Okay, cool. That'll do it. I threw an extra piece of 6-ounce tape on the back of the cockpit to give it extra strength here, and there's also 2 layers of 4-ounce cloth underneath that, so I think that's going to be pretty good. Other than that, we're on our way. It is very cold in my garage though, probably too cold, but I have time to let this sit, so it'll take as long as it needs to. At least I know it's mixed correctly. That's the main thing.
I was also told I should use real, confectioner icing bags, whatever they're called, instead of these plastic bags, because the corner of a plastic bag is a 90-degree angle, and so when you ball it all up to make the squeezy, shooty-outy stuff, it ends up just being a ball in your fist, and you can't really get good access to the edge you're trying to get into. The pastry bags, or the icing bags, are a sharper angle and are longer, and will get you closer into the seam, and just a little easier to work with, and thus helps you make a cleaner job. I also tend to leave my fillet a little bit runny because it's easier to get it into the bag from the mixing cup, but I ought to probably figure out how to put it in a little bit thicker. It would be better if it could hold its shape just a little bit better. Too runny and it'll just smear all over.
Okay, now I'll start laying in the fiberglass and get to the very next step. Not waiting. I'm going to glass almost to the ends, but I'm not going all the way because I'll get that later. It bunches up too much, so I'll piece in pieces of glass after I get this part done.
And then again, I'll just go ahead and put the glass right over top of it. And I try not to move the glass around too much, but when you're squeegeeing the epoxy all around to wet out the glass, you do end up pulling it a little bit and thus making it just a little wavy. I don't have a problem with making mistakes. I just want to make new mistakes every time. Don't want to go back and keep making the same old mistakes. And I don't glass all the way to the end all in one go. I'll go ahead and piece pieces in to the ends later on. This is just to get the main body of the hull glassed. And then after the fact, I'll go back and patch in with the pieces of fiberglass to get it right. If you try to do it all with the big cloth, it'll end up just bunched up in the end, and that's a big mess. And you can see here I'm using that pencil, the mixing stick, to just kind of wave it all around and put it in here and there. I'm not trying to dump it in and have a giant pool of epoxy that I have to pull all over the place. I'm going very sparingly at first just to get it to stick to the wood, and I'll use the roller to pick up excess and move it elsewhere. And it's just a back and forth process of just, you know, a little bit of finger painting, a little bit of adding more epoxy here and there, but very sparingly. I don't have any drips or pooling going on, so I'm only adding as much as I need to get it to wet out. And it's not really fun, it doesn't look good, but eventually the whole thing does get wet out, and then it's all fine. And you can kind of see the fillets are a little bit pulled around. And again, structurally it's fine. You know, the boat is going to be perfectly strong, but anywhere you're able to see those edges, it's just not going to be perfect. You know, when you're building a boat, I always say perfection is the enemy, but you still want to do your best.
Alright, the glass is in, and as always, it could be better, it could be worse. That's how I roll. So, on to the next thing.
Thanks for watching. Later.